Good morning, dear ones, and welcome to the Unity of Claremont Sunday lesson for August the 2nd, 2020. We're continuing with our very well-received series on biblical brides. Today's biblical bride is the $1,000,000 bride. As always, I give the context of the story first so that you have some idea of the world in which the story unfolds. It was a time very different from our own. The three patriarchs of Israel were Abraham, his son Isaac, and his grandson Jacob. And this is the story of Jacob and his wife, the matriarch of the tribes of Joseph and Benjamin. Her name was Rachel, and she is the heroine of today's lesson on biblical brides. Rachel was a $1,000,000 bride. In Rachel's day, about 1700 BC, the Hebrew people, like all their surrounding neighbors, were nomadic herdsmen living in tents. There were cities here and there, and the ancient empires of Egypt and Persia were well established. But between those two great empires, in the area now occupied by Israel, Syria, Turkey, and Jordan, people lived in small nomadic tribes, subsisting on their flocks of sheep, goats, and cattle. So it's a totally appropriate name for Rachel because in Hebrew, Rachel means migrating or journeying in droves, and it also means sheep or lamb. In other words, she personified the culture of her time. On the face of it, this story seems to be all about the romantic relationship between Jacob and Rachel, and the family strife between Jacob and his twin brother Esau, conflicts between Rachel and her sister wife Leah, and the multitude of deceptions between Jacob and his father-in-law Laban. But the story was actually written about 1,000 years later, in the 6th century BC, to establish the connection between the original 12 tribes and the patriarchs, and to emphasize the importance of the tribes of Joseph and Benjamin, who were Rachel's descendants. So, the story begins with the birth of Jacob and his twin brother Esau. The custom of the day was, in order to establish inheritance rights, the first twin out of the womb would be considered the elder brother, and that was Esau. Esau was the curly-haired and burly outdoorsman type who enjoyed hunting, while Jacob was more intellectual. He preferred spending time with his father, assisting Isaac with the administration of tribal affairs. While Esau was simple-minded, Jacob was a crafty con man, and he tricked Esau out of his inheritance. Not being prone to trickery himself, Esau decided that the best way to get his inheritance back was simply to kill Jacob, which forced Jacob to flee eastward to Haran to seek refuge with his uncle Laban, who was his mother's brother. So, with little more than the clothes on his back, he arrived at a well outside Haran, which was shared by several other families. The custom was that once all of the different flocks of sheep had arrived, the large stone covering the well would be set aside by the shepherds, and all the flocks would be watered at once. When Jacob staggered to the well, he asked the shepherds who were waiting for the other flocks to arrive if they knew a man named Laban. Yes, they did. "Is it well with him?" asked Jacob. "Yes, it is well with him, and here comes his daughter Rachel with her flocks." Jacob immediately ran and kissed Rachel. Okay, kissing was a traditional greeting between relatives, but still, without any introduction whatsoever, it was a bit forward. And as he kissed her, he began to cry, and he shouted for joy because in a single instant he had both found his family and fallen head over heels in love. Young Rachel, it turns out, was a dish, beautiful in face and form. Disregarding the local custom, Jacob, never one to be overly concerned with rules, removed the stone himself so that Rachel could water her sheep. Then Rachel took Jacob to her father Laban, who joyfully greeted his nephew, also with a kiss, and offered him every hospitality. As often happens in many families, Jacob's personality was less like that of his righteous father Isaac, and more like that of his crafty uncle Laban. They were both con men, intelligent and dishonest. After Jacob had been with him for a month, Laban discerned not only that young Jacob could be a great asset to his household, but also that he was smitten by Rachel. So Laban made a proposal. Since Jacob was penniless and could not afford the traditional bride price, he could work for Laban for 7 years, after which Laban would give him Rachel in marriage. Jacob readily agreed. He served Laban for 7 years, but it seemed to him as 7 days, so great was his love for her. At the end of the 7 years, Laban invited all his friends and relatives to a week-long wedding feast for the happy couple. As a wedding present, Laban gave his daughter a female slave named Zilpah. Following the local custom, at the end of the first day of festivities, after the sun had set, Laban gave his daughter in marriage by bringing the bride, dressed in her veil and elaborate wedding garments, to Jacob's tent, and the marriage was consummated that night. The next morning, the light of dawn revealed that the wife in his marriage bed was not Rachel, but her older sister Leah. There are many questions and many more proposed answers as to how Laban pulled this con off. Had Jacob had too much wine the night before? Were Rachel and Leah complicit or merely compliant in Laban's scheme? Why didn't Rachel speak out? Didn't she want to marry Jacob? We're not given any hints to the answers to these questions, but the story does say that Jacob immediately went to Laban and complained. There's no record of what, if anything, he said to Leah. Laban answered coolly that his tribal customs required the eldest daughter to be married first. Jacob could still have Rachel as promised at the end of the week of wedding festivities, provided he agreed to work an additional 7 years for Laban. He would even give Rachel a female slave named Bilhah for her wedding present. Jacob reluctantly agreed. Laban had won this round, but the two men were now in an ongoing cold war, and Jacob would turn the tables on Laban more than once in the coming years. So for the next 7 years, Jacob settled into his marital life with his two wives. I say marital life, not marital bliss, because his household was not a happy one. He fathered 4 sons by Leah, but he did not pretend to love her. He spent most of his time in Rachel's tent. Leah was unloved and unhappy. Her relationship with her sister wife was rocky, and to top it all off, Rachel was barren. She even complained to her husband, "Give me sons or I will die," she wailed. Was she complaining that he spent too many nights in Leah's tent? We don't know, but we are told that Jacob responded with anger, "I am not God. I cannot open your womb." In desperation, and following the same ancient custom that had allowed Sarah to give her slave Hagar to Abraham, Rachel gave her slave Bilhah to Jacob to be his concubine. And Bilhah bore Jacob 2 sons. While Bilhah was not legally equal to Rachel, her sons were considered to be Rachel's sons, and they would inherit equally with Leah's sons. Not to be outdone, Leah also gave her slave Zilpah to Jacob, who bore him 2 sons in Leah's name. Finally, Rachel did bear a son whom she named Joseph, so that Jacob finished his 14 years of service to Laban with 4 wives, 11 sons, and a daughter named Dinah. Jacob was due for a raise. He went to Laban and opened negotiations. The two men worked out an arrangement so that Jacob could have his own flocks. To avoid future misunderstandings, Jacob agreed to take the striped, spotted, and black sheep and goats, and Laban would keep the white sheep and goats. But the day before the herds were to be separated, Laban had his servants spirit away all the black, spotted, and striped animals and take them 3 days' journey to a far-off pasture. So Jacob got no animals that year. But the game was afoot, and Jacob had a trick up his sleeve. He put wooden sticks, stripped of their bark to make striped and circular designs, near the watering holes where the sheep both drank and mated. Therefore, they conceived striped and spotted lambs and kids, and Jacob's flock grew accordingly. And just to add salt to Laban's wounds, Jacob brought any weak or sickly animals to be watered where there were no striped sticks, so that Laban's share of the flocks every year tended to be inferior. This went on for 6 years, by which time Jacob was independently wealthy, and he wanted to leave Laban's employ and return home to his father's house. First, he had a private meeting with his 2 wives and proposed that they leave secretly. Both Leah and Rachel agreed that Laban had cheated them and would continue to do so. They had had enough, and the family decided to leave without warning. But just before the appointed date for their departure, Rachel snuck into Laban's tent and stole the family gods. These idols were the treasured symbol of Laban's authority as patriarch of his tribe, and should have been passed on to his eldest son when he died. We don't know why Rachel did this. Were they valuable? Did she believe that they would bring a blessing on her household? Did she want her husband to be a patriarch? Or was it simply spite? Whatever her reason, when Laban learned that Jacob had left with his daughters and grandchildren and his household gods, he rounded up a posse of armed men and charged after them. Jacob certainly could not outrun Laban due to not only having his wives and children, but all of his possessions, slaves, and flocks in tow. When the two parties met, Laban complained that he was sad to lose his daughters and grandchildren, that they need not have snuck away in the night without saying goodbye. He claimed he would even have given them a going-away party. But now he was justifiably angry because Jacob had stolen his family gods. Jacob, not knowing what Rachel had done, was indignant and probably thought Laban was lying. So he invited Laban to search through all of his tents, declaring that if anyone had stolen Laban's family gods, the person responsible would be severely punished. So Laban personally searched all the tents until he came to Rachel's. Upon entering, he found her sitting on her camel's saddle, beneath which she had hidden the idols. "Forgive me, father, for not standing when you entered, because I'm in the way of women," she said meekly. Apparently this was sufficiently repulsive to Laban's sensibilities that he did not search where she was sitting. Unable to find the missing idols, Laban and Jacob made a covenant with mutual agreements as to territorial rights, and Laban and his band of merry men left Jacob's camp with their tails between their legs. Eventually, Rachel did give birth to one more son, Benjamin. But Jacob's favorite son was always Rachel's firstborn, Joseph. This was to be the Joseph of a coat of many colors, the Joseph who became the prime minister of Egypt, the Joseph who was to play a pivotal role in the history of his people. Perhaps you're wondering why a con man is revered as one of the three patriarchs of Israel. That is another story, one of many wonderful stories in the Hebrew Scriptures. But the short answer to the question is that Jacob had a life-changing encounter with God. Later in his life, he changed, just as we all can change. So, this brings us to the metaphysical application of Rachel's story to our lives in the 21st century. The Hebrew meaning of the name Jacob is supplanter. Just as Jacob supplanted his brother Esau when he tricked him out of his inheritance, spiritual consciousness is destined to supplant sense consciousness in every person. Jacob thus represents the I am, your true self. This evolution requires what Rachel represents, the receptive soul phase of the pure natural life of every person. Rachel, meaning ewe lamb, represents the feminine receptive aspect of the pure natural life in the human organism. Since her name also means migrating, that phase of life that Rachel represents is fruitful only on the higher spiritual plane of ideas. The fact that Rachel was for a time barren signifies a transitory state. Her two sons, Joseph and Benjamin, were the result of patience and prayer, and they represent two of the 12 powers of man. Joseph represents the faculty of imagination, and Benjamin the faculty of faith. They were accepted above the other sons of Jacob, who were the offspring of Leah, the concubines, who represent the human soul at the level of sense consciousness. Simply put, the union of the I am and the receptive soul, ready and willing to change, is the birth of faith and imagination. The faculty of imagination has always been my favorite of the 12 powers. This is just an instinctive reaction, but I think I can also give a logical justification. Before we can manifest our desires, we must envision them. And conjuring up a mental picture of that which is not yet in existence requires imagination. This is a human ability that other animals do not possess. Even the smartest of mammals relies solely on the senses, the instincts, and past experiences to direct their action. We, on the other hand, dreamt of crossing the oceans, and we sailed. We dreamt of flying, and we flew. We dreamt of instant communication with those who were far away, and the telephone, radio, and internet came into being. We are creators because we are children of the Creator. We imagine, and the universe changes before our eyes. This is a choice. We can stay at the level of Jacob, using his intellect to manipulate the physical world with his wit and his sense consciousness, or we can unite Jacob with Rachel, that part of each of us that is receptive to spirit, ready to migrate, to change, to leave the boundaries built by the past, and imagine a spirit-filled world. A spirit-filled existence in which all of our 12 powers, like the 12 sons of Jacob and Rachel, are born and mature. What is the world you want? Imagine it. Just as Jacob caused spotted sheep to be conceived by putting an image in view of Laban's flocks, we can cause our heart's desires to manifest by imagining them in our mind's eye. We can envision a world not only without COVID-19, but without any diseases. We can envision a world without racism. We can envision a world without tyranny. We can envision a world without violence. All of these products of our imagination seem impossible. Some would say ridiculous. But history proves that the only way to bring the impossible into reality, the first step, is to dream the impossible dream. To ensure that we stay where we are, just keep looking backward. We can choose to stay on the level of sense consciousness, join in conversations about who is right and who is wrong, point fingers, call names, take sides, and plot our revenge. But to quote Dr. Phil, how is that working for you? Or to quote another ancient teacher, Jesus of Nazareth, he who lives by the sword dies by the sword. This choice is yours and mine. We are spiritual beings, but we are free. Every day, every hour presents the opportunity to choose. Choose to migrate or to stagnate. Light a candle or curse the darkness. Forgive or live in victimhood. One of our favorite songs when we are together on Sundays proclaims, "We are the ones. I am the one. You are the one. We are the ones." And so we are, dear ones. So we are. So let this be our closing affirmation. We are the ones. Amen. So be it. And so it is. So let me close by reminding you that you can make your love offerings to Unity of Claremont by sending a check to Post Office Box 641, Mineola, Florida 34755. And of course, you're invited to join us every Sunday for fellowship using Zoom. We meet at noon. The link is on this Facebook page and also in our newsletter. So until we meet again, let's imagine a wonderful week.